Okay.
We've got people on Zoom, we're recording,
Oh,
and then I'll also go back out here and we'll get some more people filling in.
Great.
So, hey, thanks for attending. Thank you all for attending and being here. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. And we hope this is a helpful session. Today, overall for Game Changer Week is Biotech Day, so we're running a lot of tracks. We've got this event, and then we've got another keynoter at 11, and then we've got a lunch panel that'll be talking about investments and venture capital. So we've got a lot going on today. And then this evening, we've got a reception at Eastern Divide. So Jeff Mitchell Law Firm will be hosting the Eastern Divide welcoming reception, halftime reception, sorry. So it's gonna be halftime through Game Changer. So I'll turn it over to you and your team, Alex, and welcome and thanks for doing this.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I guess there's some folks online. So this session, we kind of got together and brainstormed a little bit around what would be interesting to the audience, not knowing exactly who would be here, if they were all life science professionals or folks that were maybe in some other area of engineering or software development, looking to commercialize those kinds of technologies. But you know, in my thinking about, like, if I was just starting out down sort of my entrepreneurial path, I look online or I attend seminars and you see a lot of things about startups and how to go out and raise capital, what to put in your pitch deck, all the boxes that you need to check. But my sense is that most of that is geared towards software and technology companies. And there are some key and distinct differences for life science companies. And, you know, today I'm kind of gonna frame this conversation around therapeutics and devices, things that have like regulatory touch points, but happy to discuss, you know, diagnostics or sort of health IT or med tech generally as well. But just so you understand, we're not ignoring those other sectors, but we had to frame the conversation around something. And with that, let's jump to some introductions. So I'm Alex Euler. I'm Senior Investment Director at Virginia Venture Partners. I've been here longer than I want to admit, almost 15 years now. When I started, we didn't have much of a life sciences portfolio. I think we had 4 investments. Jeff was one of them, and that was probably led by my predecessor originally, Jeff's first company. And we now have almost 37 life science companies, I think.
It's over 60.
Well, yeah, active. Yeah, so active. So we've grown the life sciences portfolio significantly. And I'll say last year was a pretty busy year for us. 48% of our investments were in life sciences and healthcare, and almost half of the money that we invested went to life sciences and healthcare. So pretty active here. We're seeing a lot of deal flow. I think the Virginia ecosystem is growing significantly. Anyway, I'll stop and let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Oh, hi, Aurelia Flores. I'm an investment director at Virginia Venture Partners, and most of my role right now, although I do come from a direct investing background, but at BVP, I'm currently overseeing the fund of funds program. So you all might know that we are now investing in fund managers that are investing in Virginia-based companies. And so this year we invested in 7 funds, one of which is investing in life sciences.
Yeah, and then Dustin Dunbar, Senior Investment Associate. I work with both Aurelia and Alex, kind of floating between software, fund of funds, and life sciences. So just kind of the jack of all trades, I guess.
And Dustin?
Yeah, absolutely. So Virginia Venture Partners, kind of what we do is we are a pre-seed, seed stage, early stage venture capital fund, typically investing in high growth sectors. We are tech focused. However, we have been broadening our portfolio to include CPG. And then we've also broadened our portfolio to include emerging fund managers as well that are investing in Virginia with the Virginia strategy. So really what we're looking for is, again, those high growth companies that are focused on, or that are headquartered here in Virginia.
Yeah. We want to talk maybe a little bit about just VIPC more broadly.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So within VIPC is, best way to describe it is a state-owned nonprofit corporation. Virginia Venture Partners rests within VIPC as the equity investment arm. We have other divisions within VIPC. We're joined by 2 members from CCF, which is the grant awarding program for kind of the earlier stages, kind of help us with our deal flow pipeline. And then we've also got other strategic initiatives within VIPC to include smart cities, unmanned aerial systems, as well as I'm missing one. Oh, and then the SBIR, STTR national funding, so help people with the national funding grants as well.
Yeah, so there's really three programs that are probably relevant to early stage startups. The CCF program that he mentioned. So if you're pulling something out of a university, for instance, Virginia Tech, you need to do some proof of concept work. Our colleagues at the CCF program are probably the best stop for you. So they'll provide some non-dilutive funding. You'll submit a project proposal, and there's a review and award and performance period for that. Then in theory, companies would graduate. You got your proof of concept, you're ready to go out and raise dilutive investor money, and then you would come talk to the venture fund. And then Dustin mentioned the SBIR training program. So we've actually increased our awards, Virginia's awards, federal SBIR awards over the last couple of years as well. And our colleague Rob Brook manages that program. So why don't we start? What we've done, we've broken down sort of how we view investment opportunities for both software and life sciences into a couple of distinct areas, about a half dozen different areas. And what we'll do is kind of go through, for instance, product and problem. We'll talk about software, and then we can jump over and talk about some unique challenges for life science companies.
And so I think one of the things I just want to underline and jump in with questions as we go, or comments. I think some of you have a lot of experience with doing this in the past, for example. I don't know what happened, but as Alex mentioned, you do see a lot in the ecosystem about how the startup ecosystem works, and it is very much messaged to technology companies that are not life sciences. So for product and problem, on the tech side, we're looking at generally companies that are using technology to solve a unique problem for business, maybe bringing tech to a legacy industry or techifying services that have been done historically. And ideally, when we're looking for those unicorn type companies, something that's going to disrupt an industry or a market. So like a company like a Salesforce, right? Helping techify what businesses do to sell to other businesses.
Yeah, and so to contrast that from a biopharma therapeutics development company, I don't have an example here, but just working within that framework. Typically, the product is driven by some sort of unmet medical need. So there may be products in the market that either have bad side effects, they've got insufficient efficacy. There could be any number of reasons why there's some unmet need. Could be if the drug is being developed for an indication for which there is no other therapy. So typically you're trying to solve for an unmet medical need. The goal here is to improve patient outcomes. So, you think about SaaS companies, a lot of times you're talking about increasing efficiency, reducing staff, for instance, if you're using AI. There's a number of different reasons why you may adopt a software solution, but in the BioMed space, you're really trying to improve patient outcomes. Now, the caveat is that if you're selling a product that is maybe not a therapeutic, you're also looking to gain efficiency. So for instance, if you've got some other kind of med tech product that you're selling into a hospital system, for instance, they are going to be looking for efficiencies. They're going to be looking for improved patient outcomes as well. I mean, that kind of drives everything that happens in the space. But they're also going to have some other financial and efficiency considerations as well. Typically, a biotherapeutic product is going to be novel. Kind of by definition, it's you're not going to get into biosimilars and other generics, but in general, it's a novel product. And the intellectual property is usually a combination. So we'll see something that comes out of a university through a licensing process, for instance, and then the company will do some additional development and generate their own IP around that. Dustin?
Yeah, I'll let the experts talk on that. So. For team series. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. So typically what we're seeing on the software side versus the biomedical side is software we're typically seeing not really technical experts, but mostly kind of a prior business person. We will see some technical expertise, especially, say it's AI. But what we're really seeing on the life sciences and the biomedical space is a very heavily technical team, be it advisors, be it the actual founders as well. So not so much oriented towards the business sector, but more oriented towards the actual solution at hand. And so really what we're kind of seeing is there might actually be a larger team earlier on within the biomed life sciences and a smaller team on the software side earlier on as well.
Yeah, and then again, team considerations vary, I think, a little bit. Founding teams for true sort of biomed startups typically involve a faculty member from a university. So for instance, let's assume you license some intellectual property from the university. The faculty member responsible for generating the IP or the inventor will typically come with the company in some sort of fractional capacity, either as a CMO or a CTO. A lot of times we'll see postdocs, people that have worked in that lab, that have spent the last 3 or 4 years working on that technology. We love to see that, actually. If a founder came to me with no sort of background knowledge in the space or familiarity with the technology and said, hey, I'm gonna, kind of try to create the startup around this intellectual property, that would be a challenge, I think, for a lot of investors. They want people that really know the technology pretty intimately. And then the business leadership, so it's not just a faculty member. Sometimes you see that. Typically faculty members are not giving up tenure, not leaving the university, may go on sabbatical for a year. But generally, you're going to have 1 or 2 other folks associated with the company at the earliest stages. Often one of those folks is a business person. And, in my experience, they wear a lot of hats, right? And any startup, you're wearing a lot of hats. But I think in general, that person's probably focused on pulling in non-dilutive funding opportunities, executing whatever the technical development plan. So you've got some IND enabling work that you may need to do, and you're sort of acting as like a project manager there, working with the other technical folks. But I think your primary role is probably is fundraising. So it's a combination of non-dilutive and investor money that you're taking in. So teams tend to be maybe a little bit smaller. You can also leverage collaborations, and I think we mentioned this in the infrastructure slide as well. But a lot of times there's a program here in Virginia called Virginia Catalyst, and I know Jeff, you know that program well. It's an opportunity for a private company to work with some of the Virginia universities to generate data. It's similar, you submit a project and money would go to the university. The company gets the data though, right? So if you don't have a team to go do, pick your experiments, you can use this mechanism to collaborate with the universities and generate that data for the company.
And as we were thinking of examples, we realized that probably most of you are not investor geeks like we are. We couldn't really think of a company example where everyone would know who the founders were. So next slide.
For SaaS.
Okay, so for market, generally for the technology companies, again, it's likely to be a much more broad market as opposed to biomed that has a very well-defined market. And a lot of times we'll see early stage technology companies that haven't even figured out their market yet, right? They're pivoting, they're trying to figure out who exactly their market is, but it does have to be large, and we're looking at companies that are trying to shift and pivot and really figure out what their product market fit is. So a good example would be like Amazon that originally sold books to consumers and now sells cloud services to businesses.
Yeah, to add on to what really saying, what we're seeing a lot within the, SaaS, within SaaS platforms is a lot of iteration, trying to find that product market fit. So there's a constant pivot, looking for what is our actual solution and what's the actual problem we're trying to fit. Where, Alex can speak to the biomed side, where there's actually like a really good defined hard problem set that we have the solution for.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the market, just like a SaaS market, if you want a large market, so typically something on the order of $1 billion plus in terms of the annual, market opportunity. Is what we would consider. But to Dustin's point, it's usually pretty well defined. So think for instance, if you're developing a cancer therapeutic, at least in the US, you got pretty good data. Or if you're doing a surgical procedure, for instance, we got pretty good data on the number of folks who would be eligible for that particular procedure. So it's usually a little bit better defined than maybe what we see in a software company. There's a lot of overlap and competing features, and when decision makers are thinking about adopting a software solution, they've got a number of different considerations there. Don't quite have the same number of considerations the life sciences side, although there's always alternatives and substitutes for whatever product you put in the market. I'd say this is somewhat defined by competitors. So for instance, if you have an incumbent that has a dominant product, in that particular market, and you can think of an example like GLP-1s, right? So you can always develop derivatives and analogs that may have, some differential set of benefits and side effects, but they tend to kind of drive where industry is going and technology is going, and so. If I look at a market, I'm doing sort of a competitive landscape analysis for a startup therapeutics company, and I see that 5 large incumbents have two products in their pipeline addressing the same unmet need. It's a little bit tougher sell to investors, I think. And then again, we have multiple stakeholders here from a market perspective. So you're not just selling to clinicians. You're not just selling to patients, but you're also selling to strategics, because that's likely where your exit is coming from. We can talk a little bit more about that as we get into financing and how we structure deals and things like that. But that's another consideration that I think, every founder, even in software, is thinking about an exit and who a potential acquirer is. But what the trend has been to partner earlier with incumbents and strategics in the space. And so that's a consideration as well. Who's next? But yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so typically when we're looking at defensibility and moat, really when it comes to software, and the big difference between the two is that software products really don't have a heavy IP portfolio, whereas therapeutics will. There will always be IP associated with that product and that solution. And then, typically what we're seeing within the software side of things is it's mostly around the business model, is the defensibility. And then kind of like that user experience. Again, where therapeutics is the defensibility, is that novel approach and the IP.
I remember back, I'm gonna date myself, early 2000s, when there was a whole push towards software patents. And we almost never see that anymore, right? It just doesn't make sense.
It's copyrighted.
Yeah.
And Dustin made a good point about sort of defensibility. The moat, at least in my experience in software, is largely around your go-to-market and traction. So if you can build commercial barriers, that's pretty significant. So on the BioMed side, it's not patient heavy, might have heavy patients, but it's patent heavy, was what that was supposed to say. So
That's probably my typo. I will take ownership of that, sorry about that.
So it's patent heavy. So you might, like I said, you might license some core intellectual property from a university or somewhere else. You're developing your own IP. I would say a typical therapeutics company that in our portfolio probably has anywhere from 6 to 20 patents, depending on the space that they're in. So intellectual property is key here, key for defensibility. It's key for acquirers as well. So sure.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about, what's your view of some of the individuals who do software now are doing open source, so.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that's a good example, like GitHub wouldn't exist if everything was patented. In theory, it's copywriting, I guess. I'm not sure how GitHub works, but I assume they waive any rights to their code. The other kind of moat here is around the regulatory process. So, the kinds of companies we're talking about for BioMed typically are having gonna have to be, run through a regulatory gauntlet at the FDA. And that's also a barrier. If you're working in the device space, 510K, and you've got multiple predicate devices, maybe that's not a huge barrier. As it would be for a novel therapeutic that's gotta run through a full phase 1, 2, 3 in a clinical route. So that's clearly a barrier. And there are also some unique technical and manufacturing barriers. And for instance, we had a well, I mean, Jeff might even be able to speak to this. There was some unique manufacturing technology that was developed around Jeff's last company. But I think, and you can comment on that if you want, but
No, I mean, all three, my takeaway is I wish I'd learned more from the technology folks to go faster and think about commercial earlier, because that's really what matters. But from our perspective, we had a dozen patent families and 4 510K products. And you can be smart. We got 510K products that actually got better labels, better indications than the predicates, which was unusual, but a big advantage. And we also started a company where we didn't license anything, we created everything. And so we had to figure out the process to manufacture our fibers before we could assemble those fibers into implants. And then we had to design instruments to put the product in to the joints. And so those all become, when someone wants to compete with you, they need an implant, and then they need 2 years worth of instrumentation development and clearance. It just becomes a huge advantage for when the timing lines up.
yeah, that's a great example. So.
And back to your point earlier, like, I think there is such a difference when you think about the software model that is based on open source, right? What's the moat there is the business model. You're getting more users, more integration with different products that are out there, more data, more kind of adoption, really different than the BioMed side.
Really, the goal with open source, I think, is speed to market, right? You're not doing everything, all the code is not de novo, right? Like you can pull bits and pieces in, so it's really about speed to market.
Obviously you also end up with lots of super smart people who think that they're in the technology and regulatory business when they're really in the market access business and the language business. And, it's, those things are all important, but it doesn't matter until you have something to sell and you start to think about how to sell it.
Yeah, that's right.
And one thing, it just accidentally was patient having what you put, but if you think about it, in some areas, I think having access to the patient population to do the trials.
No clinical trials. Yeah,
Uh, It's very important, I guess, especially if you do something that is sort of an orphan disease. I'm somewhat familiar with one orphan disease, and the little companies are fighting for the patients to have access to the patients, so.
Well, I'll give you a quick example, well, two quick examples on just unique technical and manufacturing barriers. So one company in Charlottesville is developing a cytokine fusion product. Well, turns out there's like 4 CDMOs in the world that have the technical expertise to produce this. So that's a barrier. Another example, talking about clinical data, we invested in a company called Type Zero in Charlottesville. That company effectively had nothing but a lot of clinical data. They had the largest, this came out of UVA, and they had the largest patient blood glucose data set in the world. And they were able to develop software. The goal was to develop sort of artificial pancreas, based on some of these data sets. And that was acquired by Dexcom, 2019, maybe something like that. But that's another example of just having access to patient data is a huge barrier there, because I mean, this was like, I think it's like 2.5 million patient hours or something like that. It was pretty big. So anyway.
Yeah, so, typically, I think the biggest difference you can talk about is on business models between the two is who you're selling to. Alex mentioned earlier, when it comes to life sciences, you're selling to strategics, patient payer systems, and whereas on the software side, you're effectively selling to other businesses or consumers, right? You're not really selling therapeutic to, an actual user of that therapeutic. So there's a difference between the business models that's really kind of unique. So really just, focused on that and just kind of really looking at who in the end, especially when it comes to strategics, is going to end up purchasing the whole product and portfolio, versus, on the software side where it's more of a service, if you will.
Yeah, so the business model, and again, thinking in terms of a sort of traditional therapeutic, pretty straightforward, right? So you develop a product, you get it approved, you convince the folks that this is the drug that you need to take for that particular indication. And the company sells product, fee for service, essentially. When you start to get into other sort of healthcare and med tech sectors, you kind of run into this concept of value-based care. You don't really see this with devices or therapeutics. I don't think there's a device value.
Little bit, not so much stuff.
Yeah.
It just depends.
So this would be typically like digital therapeutics or some other sort of patient data monitoring tool, remote monitoring, telehealth, whatever the case may be, where you're looking for, again, improved, clinical outcomes, because that kind of drives everything. But they're also looking for, hey, does this save me money? The value-based piece is kind of relates to third-party reimbursement. So if you have, for instance, somebody comes in and they weren't scored appropriately for fall risk, for instance, and they fall and they get readmitted, or they end up staying in the hospital longer than they need to. The system actually gets dinged for that. And there's also a carrot piece of that, which is if you have fewer readmissions and improved outcomes, they actually receive some additional funding. And usually the company that's developing the technology will take a percentage of that additional revenue. And there's a couple of different ways how you get there. There's a regulatory process for software as a device. Medical device is one option. So there's a couple of different kind of regulatory paths for that, but we probably stay away from that.
One quick comment, it's super interesting how the mindset of value, whether it extends from investors all the way through, because if you're a tech investor in a tech company, you think if I solve a big high value business problem, what's the most chunk of that savings I can get, and that's how you create value. If you're a life science investor or company builder, the math is capped. The math already exists before you start a company. You just have to figure out what piece of the cash that flows through the healthcare system you're gonna, so better, faster for the same amount of money, and how do I get my piece of it? That's why it doesn't matter if you're NEA, right? The tech partners get angry with the life science partners because they're frustrated that they look at these two different universes of opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. That's an excellent point. And then this M&A driven bullet here kind of gets back to the previous comment I made about who the customers are. You want to think about, the business model. Yes, you want to sell product, but you're also selling to your acquirer. And so I don't know if that's really a business model, but it's a consideration when you're kind of sort of thinking about where's the business going financially, and where's the exit coming from. It's an important consideration.
I think we're supposed to be done in 5 minutes, so we
Yeah.
might want to speak through some of these.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just talk about like the biggest difference I see on between the two here is, there's multiple ways for software to kind of build the bridge and multiple paths for them to cross the river for go to market. Whereas in the highly regulated space of life sciences, there are clear stepping stones to get across the river. That's the biggest difference that, I've seen when it comes to go to market between the two.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in kind of quickly. We've covered some of this. So to go to market, it's throttled by regulatory processes. And you go to market more often than not. Certainly there are companies that go, they get a product approved, they build their own sales force, they go out and sell it. They may have distributor relationships or other third-party relationships that allow them to access markets. But I think in general, you're focused on strategic relationships, particularly with a traditional biotherapeutic product.
We could just, I guess, skip to like the financing
Yeah,
And
so
resources.
just real quick here, right, we see a lot of virtual teams in software development. So there's not a lot of infrastructure required typically, on the biomed side. You may need some infrastructure, you might need lab space, you may need manufacturing space, things like that, so it's specialized, and then. As I mentioned, you can leverage collaborators either in the university or with strategics.
I mean, this is just kind of double underlining what we said before, right? Like you can usually build an MVP at a pretty low price point on the technology side, not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll say here and. BioMed, you're typically you're not generating revenue with the SaaS company, so you can develop an MVP, like you said, go out and sell it. It reduces your burn and the capital required to grow the business. On the life sciences side, generally speaking, you're not generating revenue initially. Immediately, you may not generate revenue at all, as a matter of fact, so that means the capital requirements are a little bit bigger. They're also larger because of some of those manufacturing and regulatory requirements that we discussed earlier. So yeah, so for SaaS companies, but both of these, when you're talking about funding and investment structure, both of them are kind of milestone driven. I think on the SaaS side, you're really talking about sales more than anything else. So the pre-seed and seed, you may go out, you land your first customer, you've got a pilot. That's maybe a value inflection point. You start to generate some early revenue. It's really kind of driven by pipeline and sales. On the life sciences side, you think about how you raise capital. Oh, it's not all dilutive capital. It's not all investor money. So we definitely do. We see grants, and the CCF team certainly makes grants in software companies as well. On the life sciences side, maybe a quarter of the funding. Well, I mean, Jeff's a great example. He raised a lot of non-dilutive money. In
$26 million.
yeah, so that's not typical. I wouldn't say that's typical. Yeah. Yeah, amazing job. But we do see 25 to 50% maybe of a company's early capital requirements covered by some grants, the SBI or other awards.
The timings, the value of that non-dilutive money at whatever the dollars is so much more value. The value is so much higher early before you take money from other people, because you get crushed. Most founders are getting crushed in the early days. I funded it. I say my wife funded the company for the first 18 months until we got some DARPA funding. But we didn't have to raise money from the outside until year 5.
Yeah.
When we were gonna have a product approved, which was amazing.
And I'll say it's tough. It's tough particularly for life science companies when you're not forecasting your revenue, right? So it's a different conversation you're having, especially at the early stages. You're talking to individuals, angel investors, things like that. They're looking at their time horizon for returns, and it's 10, 12 years down the road. So non-dilutive money is super important. Just real quick, a lot of the financings that we've seen for like Series A and beyond are structured in a way that it may be a $45 million round on a 20 pre, but that money's tranched in like 3 different milestones. And a lot of times there'll be an OPM. So an optional plan of merger is what they call it. So for instance, if Pfizer comes in and says, hey, we really like what you're doing. We want to support this. At the end of phase 2, we'd like an option to acquire the company for X amount of money. And then when you talk about exits, on the software side, you see a lot of cash deals, mix of cash and stock deals. On the life sciences side, you also see a mix of cash and stock, but they're usually structured in a way that there are earnouts over a longer period of time. So for instance, if that company was acquired at phase 2, there'll be a chunk of money that comes from the acquirer at phase 3, or enrolling patients for phase 3, ending the phase 3 study, getting an NDA, and then there'll be some sales and commercial milestones as well. So yeah, I think we're out of time here.
Yeah.
Some resources. I think these slides are available
Yes.
afterwards, so you guys can take a look at these resources. Anyway, any additional questions? If not,
I'd just be a commercial for you guys. I mean, and you should spend, I'm sure you're spending a ton of time down here, but our experience with CIT and pre-BIPC and all of these, was CRCF before CCF? Is that?
that's right.
How old are you?
CCF is the CRC.
Right, CRCF, so we benefit from every single one of those programs and it all mattered. And Catalyst in particular, and that money doesn't have to go all to the university. Competitive companies, half the money can go into the company, you know.
Well, I would actually add my endorsement for the services for our startups because. Robert talked a little bit about SBIRs, but I mean, just the programs that VIPC has to do things like stacking and matching for SBIRs. Most of our companies are down this route of grants and non-dilutive. And, they're looking, SBIRs only pay for so much, but you need help and assistance to just get it in, to get commercialization plans developed and things like that. So I think these add-on sort of wraparound grants that are matched with federal dollars are huge for our startups.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for attending. Oh, there's Robert lurking in the back. I was like,